Welcome to this Roll for Crit review. Today we decided to look at one of the most well-loved games that actually held the #1 position on Board Game Geek for quite some time until finally dethroned. That's right, we're finally taking a look at Twilight Struggle.
This is, as you said, one of the most popular games out there, one of the most revered titles in board game existence. Originally came out in 2005 and still extremely well regarded today. It essentially is a reenactment of the Cold War. One player is the United States, the other is the USSR, and it's a two-player head-to-head duel where you're trying to gain control of, the world, basically.
Yes.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and this is a game that, in spite of its reputation, is one that the two of us really had not played until very recently, really sitting down to do this review. So yeah, I think we have a different perspective too coming into it from as newbies, looking at this as this thing that everyone's talked about for so long. If you are not familiar, let's run through the gist of the game. Basically, it's a card game, and you're going back and forth playing cards, and each card has a different event on it, and they're all related to real historical events, either a thing that happened or a person, a political figure, what have you.
Right, you're playing in rounds, which are called turns, which you'll get to, and you'll be given new cards as you go along. So like some of these actually say late war, they actually don't come up till the end of the game. So it's sort of actually you'll play events that probably won't appear until early on in the Cold War, things that wouldn't make sense like the wall coming down near the end of the war.
Yeah, you are actually progressing through multiple years, so you really are going through this time period chronologically. And each card also has a number value, so if instead of using its event and just reading its text and doing what it says, you may want to use the number, which will let you do multiple things. Primarily, what you want to do is take over this map, so in that way it's kind of an area control game.
Right, you're going to be pretty much using the cards to either try to place more influence in different states or countries, or you probably even try to push the influence around a little, or even throw a coup. But by doing military actions, you may also lower the DEFCON. And as you know, since this is really the age of possible nuclear war, you really don't want to hit that final end. Whoever pushes it to the very end loses out completely. However, there is a catch with those cards. While there are neutral cards, some of them will be specifically made for the USA or for the USSR. And if you have the one for your opponent and you use it for the star ability, you actually trigger the event on it, helping your opponent.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic because, most games like this, you would each have your own deck. But in this case, you might end up with a hand of cards that is meant to help the other team. So you really have to be strategic as to when you play those, because sometimes they may not trigger fully depending on the conditions. And there are a couple ways, but not many, to get rid of a card without actually using its ability.
Yes, one of the big and fun ones is the space race, which also took place during this time, and you can discard cards and hope to try to push up and get closer and closer to the best technology in space. And if you're ahead, you will get advantages, such as maybe being able to use 2 cards to possibly get into space, or even forcing your opponent to play cards before you so you can really get that advantage in knowing what they're planning to do.
Yeah, so essentially the goal is to get victory points, and sometimes as you play there are going to be scoring cards that will come out. We've got a bunch here, and anytime one of these comes up, you're going to look at the region that it applies to on the board, and you score it according to different rules. Basically, whoever has if you have just presence there, meaning you just have any influence there whatsoever, you get a little bit of points. If you have enough points to have control of some of those areas, that's worth more. Or if you have control of these battleground countries, which are marked in red, that's worth even more. And that will happen when you draw those cards, as well as at the very end of the game if you go through all of the 10 turns that are involved. So that's a really important thing. That's a #1 reason you want to be present in those areas and get those points.
Yeah, they're pretty much where a lot of the points are going to come from. And if anyone hits 20 before the end, they actually just win the game.
Yeah.
So what happens is when these point cards get played, once they're in the discard pile, for example, let's say Europe was scored, all of a sudden you're all going to start focusing, the 2 people, this is in multiplayer, might start focusing somewhere else, knowing that Europe isn't going to come back into the deck again for a while, depending on. So it also becomes, you just see power shift quickly here and there, and or maybe someone is quietly setting up over here and you don't realize it until next thing you know, like, wait, you just knocked me out of that entire region.
Yeah, and one thing that makes the victory points even more interesting is it's not just a straight I have more than you have less than me. It is one track, and the side that it's on draws directly from the other side. So if I gain 5 points, my opponent loses 5 points, essentially.
Right, it's more of like a tug of war instead of a simple just who's higher than the other.
Exactly, so it can really feel like there's large swings in either direction over the course of the game. You'll see some powerful cards, some powerful moves, and back and forths that are really dynamic and fun to watch. Essentially, it is a pretty simple game. The complexity really comes from just how many of these cards they are and how unique they are and how they all bounce off of each other. But the kind of basic turn-to-turn thing is you play a card, I play a card, you play a card, I play a card.
I mean, that really, you can boil it down to that, but unfortunately, there's so much more that happens because of these cards.
Or fortunately.
Fortunately, yes. In terms of if you were hoping for a simple game, maybe you should be warned. But this does have some amazing complexity. Every turn you have to be thinking, okay, because he has influence here, he will be able to jump here. But if I have control here, it's more expensive for him to go here. So maybe I want to use the turn to go there. But then I'm leaving Mexico open for him. Yeah. And you always start thinking back and forth, like, where can I spend the most points to maybe hold him off? And because you could have that mix of cards in hand, of both cards good for him and bad, like, I'm going to have to play this card eventually. So how can I maybe mitigate it so it doesn't hurt as much? Maybe, for example, it says he gets to double the number of points of somewhere in South America. And you're like, well, if I make it so he has nothing there, it's worthless for him. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's definitely, like, compared to a game like that you think of as being complex, like a Twilight Imperium, for example, to use another, where the rule book is so thick and really the challenge is like understanding it. This game, the rules are fairly simple, but like you said, there's just so much to keep track of that you have to be aware of. You have to be a good player.
And speaking of like connected to historical and complex cards,
right?
They will literally be events like you'll put this on the board if there was the U.S.-Japanese mutual deal, and then you can't ever coup there as Russia or something like that. Mm-hmm. And all these crazy things, then you put it on the field. But then it could be that they play this card, which cancels that, like when this war propaganda happens and it becomes this whole crazy thing.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of capturing a theme, this does it extremely well. For a game that I think when you first look at it, and if you look at that rule book, this looks like I'm about to be told I have 30 minutes to write an essay in this book. And you look at the board, and it's very dry. And you would expect a very, I think, kind of staid Euro game, which it kind of is, but because the cards are so thematic, it doesn't feel like that. It really does feel like a reenactment of this war.
It does capture the political part. Like, the Cold War, in my mind, some of the few things you think is like the missile crisis and nuclear and like spies, and then there's the politics of like the smaller things. You think of the coups in like Latin America onwards, or like trying to fight for power, and that's what this is.
The psychological warfare is a huge aspect of it, especially because, like I said, we were coming into this game as new players, but for people who have played it before, even on your second game, you're going to experience this. Knowing what some of these cards are ahead of time, there's so much meta play and trying to read your opponent and trying to figure out what cards do they have and when, especially like with these scoring cards and trying to determine, I have this scoring card, this hasn't come out yet. There's a good chance they are going to try to go for Africa right now. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't.
Right. Like if you see someone happy and you're putting maybe a bit more effort in Africa than usual.
Right.
They might have the Africa scoring card, so maybe you should get down there fast.
Or, maybe they expect you to think that and they're doing that as a bluff. There could be all kinds of things.
That actually is one of the things you have to be very careful about, I think, is if someone's played this already a few times versus someone who's new,
yeah.
They're just going to know some of these cards and know that like a certain card hits in the mid game that, just is going to swing the power their way.
Yeah, you definitely want to be on even playing ground. That is a tough thing for this. They do give you a pretty good reference sheet here.
Yeah, look at this. A full page.
Full page.
Thank you.
And on the back, they even list every card and what era it comes out in, which is also pretty helpful,
especially for the points
game.
things.
Yes.
Because knowing that, like, I believe Central America, like these few.
Only a few come out in the early section.
Yeah, so you know that they're not going to be that. You shouldn't maybe throw all your eggs in that basket early on.
Right. There's a lot going on.
Another small thing which I love, if you, the instruction booklet, there's actually a section where if you can look up a card, it'll tell you where the historical reference is that's referring to, which is pretty cool because we actually we looked up, what was it, bear trap. We're like, what was the bear trap?
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff. If you're interested in this period of time, this era, this war, this is really great. I think for educational purposes in general, they take some liberties here and there. Not that I would really know because I don't know anything about history. I'm dumb, but in general, I feel like you really do learn a lot from this.
Well, for me, I think also it scratches the itch that you would really want from a risk game. Like this has that territory control, but it's not all based on luck. There is some luck to it, which it can be a little annoying, as you said. Like if you get a hand all of your opponent's cards, you could just be like, this stinks. Yeah. Or in Jonathan's case, the dice could just hate you.
There are dice rolls, although there isn't combat per se.
Right, it's more of just fighting for influence, and it's not usually as defeating as risk can feel, where...
Yeah, it's something that if you're gonna do it, you know you're taking a risk versus it's your only option.
Not only that, there's a lot more ways, I think, compared to risk that I can recall, besides just throwing out units which can be killed, that you can sort of push the odds in your favor. But then, which can be annoying. But still, overall, I felt like playing, I think part of it, because it's designed, this is a 2-player game, 1v1. Even though there will be analysis paralysis, especially in something like this, where one turn, like multiple times, there are times where like, if I played that one card, everything would have been so different. But because it's the 1v1, it helps it make it that easy to laser focus, which works very well.
Right.
And honestly, because I think it fits that risk, what I want from risk so well, it's almost like this is what I want reskinned into everything. Yeah. I don't need Metal Gear Risk. I need Twilight Struggle Metal Gear.
Yeah, it came out in the right direction there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question this is better than Risk. Yeah, or Twilight Struggle Legacy.
That could be an interesting one.
Could work. I mean,
but I feel like that'd be harder with the historical references.
Yeah, that is the tough part, because that's one of the things.
You have to make up some stuff.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, this president never came into being.
Yeah. I'm just glad the Cold War is all behind us now. We don't have to think about this anymore. But yeah, it really is. I mean, you can see why it has its reputation. I think especially as a competitive head-to-head game, like you're saying, for 2 players, this is something that I can understand why in tournament play people would love to just sit and watch 2 people play, because the choices that you can make, and like again, especially knowing what some of those cards are that are coming out and how they can impact you and what effect they can have and when, depending on when they come out, it's just really engaging, really exciting, honestly.
Yeah, no, because it's boiled down, designed specifically for this player and this player,
right.
But not in the sense of like, here's your 2 own decks. Just knowing, I can see why you could just focus a long time on the cards and be like, all right, so if you were to draw this card in this era, it'd be good with this card, but now you don't want to use it as your opening headline.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many of these, and the combinations of how you can play them, yeah. I mean, it's endless.
It's definitely interesting too, because we read a little bit on, not too much, because we didn't want to try to give either of us an advantage over the other person, because we're both stupid then, and feels a little better. But like how some, like one side may be better as maybe in the early game, and one's better in the late game. It's up to you to find out on your own and play it.
Twilight Struggle. Here are our crits and misses. For crits, the historical theme and accurate references really build to immerse you in this war and this time period. Thanks to a large number of unique cards and possible play combinations, there is a ton of depth of strategy. The cards that you can play feel powerful and impactful on the game without feeling too unbalanced, which I think is a tough thing to pull off for a head-to-head game with so many very effective cards for both sides.
Considering that there were cards for both sides from a shared deck, it became very interesting to see which powerful cards for which side would come up as the game progresses.
The game is expertly built for two-player competitive play, so if you like those head-to-head duel games, this one definitely fits that niche.
This is definitely a must pick up if you do enjoy two-player games. And of course, there are a few misses. Because many of the cards have interactions with each other because history is not one single event, there are a lot of little fiddly bits to remind you, such as small pogs of different things that interact with each other, maybe cancel each other or allow for things, which can be a little hard to track sometimes.
There's just so much going on that board, and if you're not really into it, it can be a bit of a headache.
While the majority of it is not random and much more strategic thinking and placing of influence, there will be some times when you may draw a terrible hand of all opponents' cards or just constantly bad dice rolls.
Yeah, I think if you're a really good player, you'll pretty much always have a way to get around those situations, but for people who aren't as experienced, there is still that randomness that can just screw you up.
And finally, there were some weird rule things that we just found a little hard to get used to. For example, a turn is usually what we'd refer to just your own little thing, when it's actually what would be what we'd call a round. So that's fun to get that terminology across. And because the way that points work, while interesting in sort of a tug-of-war fashion, it can lead to some really weird math and making sure you got the points right when scoring.
So Twilight Struggle, it's a big one. We finally managed to get it to the table. I think we've had a copy for a long time, but it's one of those things where, it's hard for us specifically to always get two-player games, honestly, because usually we're in larger groups. And to finally get it out there, it is one that is very satisfying. Definitely can be a little bit stressful. Definitely can be intense, but in a good way. I think it does, like we said, again, really captures the feeling of the Cold War.
Yes, putting in the time and effort into it will reward you greatly. There, we definitely can see why this has made the top of the Board Game Geek list for so long.
Yeah, I mean, really the only thing I would say is if you just don't have a second person to play with or you're in larger groups, avoid it. But otherwise, if for some reason you've managed to, like us, not play this for so long, you definitely should pick it up. I mean, it's a classic for a reason. It's Twilight Struggle. Don't be intimidated by the rules or the look of it. It's really a lot more exciting and dynamic and thematic than you might guess just from looking at the box art, for example. So I think that's going to do it. Please let us know in the comments your thoughts on Twilight Struggle, and we'd really love to hear from people their strategies. If you're someone who's played the game a lot, do you have a preference for which side that you play? Are there specific card combos that like you just always use or that never work the way they're supposed to?
And of course, in something like this, even the back of the book had maybe a couple. If you maybe have a house rule because you think something just maybe broke. I mean, we just started to delve into this game, so we don't even know if there's some really weird combo that just doesn't work, or maybe something small that just makes the game so much more fun.
Yeah, or if you're a Russian bot and you want to link us to some spyware or something, please do that too. Hey, until next time though, I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Will.
And this was a patriotic Roll for Crit review.
Or was it?
Oh. Hey, if you liked this video, then like this video and subscribe to our channel for more board game content.
Would you kindly do it now?